So today I'll be talking to you about sort of a recent a paper I'm about to submit, right, with fellow co-authors on collective learning and human evolutionary success. So it is a work in progress somewhat, and so any feedback, positive or negative, would be welcome, sincerely welcome at the end. Okay, so first off, we have two co-authors here. It's Jacob Hirsch, University of Toronto, and Alex Bentley here at UTK, and some funding source. This is the plan. I'll talk about the role of social learning in collective action, and I'll define what I mean by that. I'll distinguish imitative learning from collective learning. One is really well known, and the other one is really not. I'll talk about the development and nature of collective learning. I'll then transition and talk about how collective learning allows for collective cognition, and I'll define what that term means. Talk about the role of collective learning in cumulative cultural evolution, the role of collective learning and human uniqueness, and then finally close with collective learning in digital media. Hopefully I can do all this in 15 minutes. Okay, so before I start on the specific topic, I want to kind of tell you my general orientation as a psychologist. I generally refer to myself as a social psychologist, but even within that milieu, I feel like I have a bit of a different perspective than most psychologists. I have a colleague from psychology that probably will agree with me. So what do most psychologists do? What most psychologists do is they study these cognitive psychological mechanisms that produce memories, emotions, judgment, etc., that lead to successful individual action. Right? That's sort of the mantra of the field for the most part. I look at it differently. Of course, I'm not the only one, but I look at it from this perspective. I study the psychological cognitive mechanisms that lead to the kind of memories, emotions, and judgments that are attuned and are functional for successful collective action. Right? So I'm still studying psychological mechanisms. I'm just interested in those psychological mechanisms that prepare us for successful collective action rather than individual action. And I'll talk about what collective action is, the way I think of it. Right, so what I really mean is interdependent action, where the behavior of one individual on an outcome really depends on the behavior of others, right? So, prototypical example is a soccer game, right? Can't win a soccer game alone. War, group hunting, all of those kind of activities require the cooperation, collaboration, coordination of several individuals in a common task. Okay, so what I'm going to be specifically talking about in terms of collective action today is the role of social learning. Is there a role for social learning in collective action, and what is it? So, social learning, what is it? So the way the literature, the cultural evolution literature treats social learning, it juxtaposes it to individual learning, right? We can either learn from the past success or failure of others, right? Or we can engage in costly trial and error. This could be termed in different ways. Some people call it social learning, some people call it observational learning. I'm going to call it mostly imitation, okay, or imitative learning. And obviously it's extensively studied in the field. It's attributed with all sorts of accolades in terms of its ability to explain cumulative cultural evolution, human conformity, et cetera, right? So here's an example, a little kid imitating his dad, let's say in learning how to tie a tie, right? You can imagine that learning how to tie a tie yourself would be a fraught endeavor if you couldn't imitate somebody, right? By the time you learn how to tie a tie, years pass, right? But imitating someone, much easier. The other thing I want to say about social learning from this perspective is that social learning is very much, people who socially learn are almost seen as scroungers, not quite parasites, because they don't harm the host, but scroungers in that they don't really contribute anything new to the group, right? They're not really developing any new knowledge. They're using existing knowledge for their purposes and avoiding the costs of accrual of that knowledge. So this is social learning from others, or imitative learning. And the important thing about imitative learning is that when the environment changes drastically, right, it becomes maladaptive. So if you're copying the tying of the tie of your dad that he learned 30 years ago, and it's completely out of fashion, even though you copied correctly, it's not going to be that functional for your behavior in the present day because you look like a slob, right? So if the environment changes, the past success or failures of others have kind of less meaning, right? And so being guided by those past behaviors, imitating is a bit maladaptive. Not a bit, but quite a bit maladaptive. So you don't want to copy behavior that's, out of step with the current reality. And importantly, I'm not talking about, whether you imitate correctly or not. I'm assuming you don't do this, right? I'm assuming successful imitation, but nonetheless, it doesn't matter because what you're imitating is out of step with what is needed currently, right? It's no longer an adaptive strategy, adaptive skill. So I'm going to juxtapose this position on social learning, that is learning from others, to social learning with others. And I'll explain what that is in a second. And the argument is that social learning with others, unlike social learning from others, remains adaptive when the environment changes quickly. And in fact, it is quite adaptive, not just remains so. And the environment doesn't have to change exceptionally dramatically for it to be adaptive. Every day, so I pulled this from the internet, a group of hunters preparing to strike, I suppose. You can argue, for example, that they are about to commence in a group hunt where a lot of what they do has been learned from their forefathers, right? So imitation is responsible for, let's say, their weapons and their clothes and maybe some of the techniques that they will use, right? So imitation is important here, but there's a little bit, there's something else going on here too, right? As they look over the peak, they will gaze upon a situation that nobody has ever seen before. It's going to be unique in some way, shape, or form, right? There's uncertainty about what they will see. The deer will be in a position that they've never seen before, right? As deer tend to do, and so on. And what they'll have to do is they'll have to learn collectively. In fact, the argument is that anytime you engage in a collective action in the face of any uncertainty, right, you need social learning with others. So the full argument, I'll outline is this one. So at the inception of the process, you have collective learning, which is learning together, learning with others, as opposed to learning from them, that leads or enables powerful forms of collective cognition, which is basically thinking together. I'll talk about what that is later on. And that allows for acting together or collective action. Okay, so where does it start? It starts with joint attention, right? I'm sure some of you know there's a very large literature on joint attention in developmental psychology. Apparently, around 9 months of age, we develop this ability, or interest rather, to track where other people are looking and engage in triadic eye gaze with our caregivers, right? So here are some examples. Developmentalists have shown that this is quite important for normal language development. In fact, if a kid doesn't show joint attention behaviors, coordination of eye gaze with their caregivers, at 9 to 12 months of age, people start to worry about autism, language delay, and so forth. So it's an important behavior to coordinate. Now, from joint attention, I'm going to transition quickly to something I call shared attention. And there's a key distinction between joint attention and shared attention that I'll discuss next. All right, so let's say I'm walking around campus and I see a tree. I can then surmise, assume that I'm perceiving it, right? So another way of talking about it is that I have an attentional schema of where I'm attending. A thought pops into my head, quite implicit, I'm attending to X. I'm attending to the tree, right? Same situation on the right, but here, for some reason, I think I'm not alone. I think I'm together with other people. So a perception is evoked where we are attending to the tree. In both left and right are constructed perceptions. Each is no more metaphysical than the other, right? There's no I and there's no really we, right? They are constructions of our mind in each case. So, and I mention this because when I'm talking about this, people are very comfortable. And when I get to this, it's all of a sudden like I'm postulating that there's a collective consciousness and group mind, and people get a little squeamish. And really, they have the same ontological status, right? They're just perceptions of what we think we're doing. Either I think I'm attending to a tree, or I think we are attending to the tree, right? Both are perceptions. The difference between joint attention and shared attention being here, is that I can have shared attention hallucinating fellow others, right? I can have shared attention assuming that others are looking without directly observing their gaze, posture, hand-eye coordination, etc. Right? So, in other words, shared attention is kind of joint attention on steroids. It becomes a mere belief state where I believe we're attending together, rather needing direct observation of other people's gaze cues and postural cues. So here's an example where clearly you can have joint attention or shared attention, right? Others' eye gaze is available to you, so you know if you're triadically coordinating. But here's an example where you don't, right? You see no others, but you're attending to a radio broadcast, and you have good reasons to assume that you're not attending alone. So I would say you're in a psychological state of shared attention. That is, you perceive that we are attending to X. Same thing with television. Same thing with social media. Facebook, a couple of years ago, came out with this great feature where you now can see when somebody is writing beneath a post, right? With this ellipsis, right? A really clever cue to let you know that you're not alone looking at this post here. Somebody is consuming it and, in fact, interacting with it, evoking a state of shared attention, right? So without any direct observational cues, yeah. Yeah. Well, at that age, I mean, at that age, I'm not sure. What are they, 4 or 5? It's probably joint. I would imagine that they need the behavioral cues, the postural, the gaze cues to enter to consider joint attention psychologically. And I think as you mature into adulthood, you can sustain the mere belief we're attending without those direct cues, and at that point I would call it shared. Well, for most of you, it's just shared. I think for the most part, you're assuming we're co-attending. You don't need to check for other people's eyes. But of course, it's a rich informational environment, right? And so some things will, you will assume shared attention based on local cues, right? So if I say something provocative, for example, you might assume a stronger state of shared attention with your audience, right? You're going to use your background knowledge of the world and your experiences to have stronger or weaker states of shared attention. They're not directly tied to your observation of other people's gaze and physical bodies. And that allows you to have shared attention states with unseen others, with a multitude of unseen others, right? So 9-month-olds have joint attention with caregivers, and it's pretty proximal. It's a pair bond, right? While human adults presumably can do so across vast distances and populations. Questions? All right. So this is collective learning in a nutshell, right? That you attend with others, and when you sense that you're attending with others, that is, you have the perception that we are attending, which is based on some sort of assumption about your environment, without observation of other behavioral cues, although you could have observation of behavioral cues. That's one way to enter it, for sure. My point is that you just don't need the eye gaze anymore in adulthood. That leads to greater cognitive processing of whatever you think you're co-attending, And that leads, most importantly, to mutual knowledge. And I'll talk about what I mean by mutual knowledge in a second. Okay, so how would this work? Okay, so imagine a scene that's a pretty chaotic scene. You're in a restaurant, lots of novel information coming in. To do well in this environment, you have to be pretty attentive, but to what, right? So many stimuli happening. So you need to pay attention to new things. That's one goal. But you also must maintain mutual knowledge. Well, why is that? Why should you maintain mutual knowledge? What is mutual knowledge? What I mean by mutual knowledge simply is, let's say you're sitting at this table over here, right? If you're to understand the conversation that's happening at your table that uses a lot of indirect references, you need to have kind of the same knowledge activated as the other people at your table, right? So imagine that a waiter passes by your table, takes your check, and slams it on your table, right? And one of your friends says, well, that was weird, right? Referring to that act. You, however, you were not really attending to what your friends were attending to at the time. You were looking elsewhere, maybe, at the bar, planning your next drink, right? Idiosyncratically. And you have no idea what they're referring to, right? So what do you mean? What was that? What is weird? Right? While the rest of the people at the table know exactly what that indefinite reference is referring to, right? Because why? Well, because they prioritize things that they thought were shared with the group members at the table, right? So learning new information with others is a way to create mutual knowledge among co-attendees against which conversation can be understood, right? Without that creation and constant maintenance of mutual knowledge, that conversation is much harder to understand. You keep on asking questions then, like, what was weird? What are you talking about? Right? And they laugh at you and then never call you for dinner again. So, just kidding. Okay, so learning with others allows you to get novel knowledge and also maintain it with your group members. Imitative learning is not really up to the task because you're constantly playing catch up, right? If you're just imitating, you're the person that's saying, well, what was weird? What were you referring to, right? You don't arrive to the information at the same time that others do, right? And that's the other thing about mutual knowledge, is that it's in continuous flux. It's in continuous flux because the environment is in continuous flux, right? And because the environment is in continuous flux, you must prioritize things that if you intend to communicate with someone, you must prioritize the same thing in your environment as they are, right? And that's why shared attention has this sort of an effect. So then I'm going to transition to some studies, some data that show experimental results in terms of the effects of shared attention on affect, cognition, and behavior. But before I do that, I can answer any questions if I've lost somebody in the argument. Yeah.
I was wondering what proportion of knowledge needs to be maintained in imitative sort of ability to learn versus this shared conception to work. Because if you had 100% that you were negotiating all the time, then you would have a breakdown as well. Or how quickly can the environment change, or how much can you erode the environment before shared learning doesn't work?
Yeah, well, obviously, I'm not, first of all, I don't know. That's a pretty precise question about percentages. I can tell you, for example, that, there does need to be a lot of imitation for this, in this picture as well, right? Because let's just say your ability to interact with people at your table certainly depends on your general knowledge of English, okay? And your general knowledge of English is going to depend on some level of imitative learning that you've done in the past, right? But no level of knowledge of English is going to allow you to really fluently interact with people at the table without collective learning at the table. Because English is, like any other human language, is really indefinite. It doesn't mean precise things until the context in which it is used. And it keeps shifting as the conversation goes on.
I have a question about sort of theoretical logic. Maybe I missed something. So coming back to your first charts, You mentioned that collective learning, social learning, leads finally to effective behavior
Yeah.
through sharing memory, emotion level, cognitive level. So if we take as a final criteria, ultimate effective behavior, my question is, or my, let's say, problem is that I'm thinking about a situation like, let's say, huge crowd. And time to time we read in press about, mass fire in Russia or, mass shooting, United States. It happens time to time. And as a rule, those participants of that event who shared what majority is thinking, is perceiving, is doing at emotional, cognitive, whatever level, and if he or she share this, let's say, process, participate in this process, finally he or she will die.
Yeah. Yeah,
Killed
sure.
or burnt or whatever. And only those who, observing that, I don't know at what level, cognitive, emotional, behavioral, finally decides not to follow them and to take, let's say, another exit or to hide during shooting or whatever, could survive.
That's true.
So my question is, what is the age, the moment, the factor, whatever we call it, that distinguish the person, the participant of that process that you describe, that the effective behavior finally in favor of this person to survive, for example, or to reach some aim, could by definition differ from the most of the people, to keep distance from collective learning, memory, whatever. So what is the criteria? Thanks.
Yeah, okay, that's a hard question. I'll start with the fact that no adaptation is perfect.
It's a very long question.
Yeah.
So maybe you should wait until.
Okay, I'll take it after.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a good question. I'll definitely address it. Okay, so let me show you some studies real quick. The cute puppy dogs chasing their mother, aiming to feed. So this is the kind of thing we show our participants, okay? And I've shown this sort of video to our participants. So I mostly do between subject experiments. And what that means is the participant, the person, is assigned to one of 3 or 4 conditions, right? One of the conditions is going to be one of shared attention, where I think, the person is convinced that they are attending together with similar others, that is, we are attending to X. And there are going to be a variety of control conditions where that is not present for some reason or another. And the reason for the variety of control conditions is because it allows you to discount some alternative explanations in psychological discipline, like social facilitation, imitation, etc. I can discuss it more, but I kind of want to get through to this to the rest of the argument. But so here, it's actually an online study. You log in, and then you see that other people log in, and by sort of these kind of implicit cues through the experiment. By the way, you're doing this in the privacy of your own home, or wherever people do online experiments from. And you basically are getting a cue that others are going to be co-attending to this video with you. And here, everybody is slightly similar to you in avatar choice. And in the control conditions, others see it first, and you see it after them. Then there's another control condition where you see it first, and they see it after you. And then you see it alone, right? That's another condition. And then you're asked to just write about the kind of thoughts that occurred to you during the video for about 2 minutes, and you're asked how happy you are afterwards. So the avatar similarity, I haven't mentioned that yet, but obviously this kind of collective learning through shared attention wouldn't happen with people who mean nothing to you. You have to have some sort of even minimal bond to others, right? So the way I do this online is to convince you that people have, a similar preference in animals or a similar preference in color to sort of evoke that sort of relational bond. And obviously in the shared attention condition, you have that, and you have synchronicity as well. So why do we do this? Well, if you're more likely to pay attention when you think we are attending to something, right? Then we should see that in your reflections on your thoughts during that video. We should see that you write more about the video, right? And remember, these are people taking it online, so who knows what they're attending to? There are probably a million windows open on their computer and so on. So, it's important to kind of know whether they were actually attending or not, whether they were actually thinking about it or not. And so this is the critical test for that. We basically identify, we code all the words that they used in their description of what they thought about, right? For the percentage of video words, anything to do with puppies, feeding, mother, chasing, things like that. And we find that in shared attention condition, when you think we are attending together, you have greater amount of video words used. And because it's a happy, it's a happy video, people also tend to be happier, of course, because they reflect on sort of a happy theme. So beyond sort of emotional videos, we've done a number of studies with goals, where instead of an emotional video, you're sort of given a goal. This is an experiment where the goal is embedded in a word recognition task. It's kind of a standard task in psychology where you're given a bunch of words and then you're tested on them. And the goal here is avoid being incorrect. So we call this a prevention goal, right? Where we tell you what not to do versus what to do. And you see this goal with similar others, with different others this time, right? So you are synchronously looking with others, but they're slightly, you have no relationship with them. Or similar others are present, but you don't know what they're looking at. The goal is always the same. And what we really are interested in is the dependent variable of false alarm rate. Why false alarm rate? Well, there's a psychological literature on this where when you tell people what not to do versus what to do, they tend to decrease their false alarm rates in this word recognition task. And that's what we find, that in the shared attention condition, there are lower false alarm rates than in the other two conditions, suggesting that they just paid more attention to the goal we gave them when it was in the shared attention condition, right? So greater cognitive processing of the stimulus under shared attention. We also did a study where we flipped it, where we gave them a promotion goal. That's an opposite goal from prevention, where you ask to do something. And there, your hit rates rise as opposed to the other conditions, and that's what we saw. Here's a more commonsensical study where we looked at behavior internalization. You have a shared attention condition, others see it first, you see it first alone. I really like these two because it's like you're seeing it with others, but slightly at different times. So it feels like a very kind of powerful test of the idea that it's really synchronous co-attention that's needed. And remember, you can't see these other people, right? You're presuming they're watching with you. Okay. Anyways, so what you're seeing is either a chat or a paragraph format of a conversation between two engineers about breaks that capture energy, I believe. Then there's a task where you write about the ways in which a common shopping cart can be improved. We all know shopping carts are a terrible technology. They stub toes and can't really move them around very easily. And we need a better one. Can you talk to your supposed partner? They have a supposed partner about how to improve it. Right? And you're the first one. You're the first one that's going to send ideas. We're not really interested in their ideas. What we are interested in is the format in which they put these ideas, right? Are they going to use chat form? Are they going to use paragraph form? And we index that by percentage of line breaks they use in total text, with double line breaks counting as more of a chat form versus more of a paragraph form. And in terms of results, what you see is actually people only learned in the shared attention condition. So when they thought they're co-attending with others, they prioritized the conversation between the two engineers, but not only the content of the information, right? But really the style of it, right? And then they internalized to such an extent that when given an opportunity to write their own writing 5 minutes later, they recreated it to a greater extent. So you see greater rate of line breaks in the chat condition if they co-attended to chat, and lower in the paragraph condition where they co-attended to the paragraph. Final study.
Will experience in their
This is Representative
This is
Rosa DeLauro talking about
problem for young women today. Women that
a law preventing violence against women act. A very positive message. Most people would pretest it, and most people would agree with it, right? But what we really wanted to do is see whether this message over here is important, right? So you see that currently connected viewers, 98. We kind of faked a C-SPAN website, so people thinking they're on C-SPAN and trying out a new feature, and there are multiple conditions. They either see that, why is that doing that? They either see the live condition, which you saw, they saw a recorded 100 condition, and then there's a recorded condition. And then we basically check their attitudes. If they paid more attention, right, and it's a positive speech at baseline, they should get even more positive in their ratings in the live 100 condition. And that's what you basically see across all the items. Opinion of speech, speech compelling, trust, reliability. The grain line here, the co-watching viewers, people in that condition had the most positive opinions of the talk. You'll see 4.5 is the medium scale point. It goes all the way to 1. So everybody is above 4.5, right? So generally people like the speech. It's just that people in the shared attention condition paying more attention in terms of cognitive processing like it even more. How am I doing on time? Okay. Now we flipped it where instead of giving him a positive speech that most people like, we gave him a negative speech. This is Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma. Maybe you guys remember he came into the chambers and threw a snowball into the audience. It's a very kind of weird speech that most people don't see as insulting, not convincing, even conservatives. So we thought it would be a good one to use. We also have the same condition, except the live 100 is to a recorded stream. So it's clear it's a recorded stream. It's not happening now, right? It's just that there's other people co-attending with you right now. And the reason why we did that is because, well, maybe it's because there's something about it happening now that's really important, right? And that's really not the theory. What's really important is that others are co-attending with you now. It could be a speech from last year. That shouldn't matter. And that's the case here. It was clearly a recorded speech. It said so on sort of at the top. And in terms of results, we see the opposite effect across all the items, all the same items, to the extent possible, where nobody liked him, right? Everything is below 4, but people in the shared attention condition, co-watching viewers, the deep gray, really didn't like him across all these items. So this is just a sample of the studies on shared attention. And mine is not the only lab that does this, right? There are labs in Germany and Britain and Australia and Israel that do these kind of studies. And in general, the argument is for shared attention, where conditions of emergence of shared attention state is when you think you're co-attending synchronously with relationally close others. Why? Well, these two preconditions lead you to the perception of we are attending to something together, right? This we is not really possible without some minimal connection to the other. You can't be thinking of them as a chair, right? My chair and I do not co-attend to anything, right? But my wife and I do, in my mind. And also the synchronicity is important, right? For this perceptual state as well. We are attending to something. I'm not talking about the theoretical reasons right now. I'm just talking about the sort of the emergence conditions for the psychological state itself. And that leads to cognitive prioritization of X, or another way of saying that is greater cognitive resources to X. And across quite a few studies, that has led to better memory for X, stronger motivation if X was a goal, more extreme judgments if X was some sort of a more valent context. Same thing for higher effective intensity, and then greater behavioral learning if X is a model of behavior. I should also briefly mention Skorich et al., this is not my work, recently replicated the memory effect of shared attention, but he did an interesting thing. Also, he found that words are better remembered when under shared attention versus not, right? So this person is being told, the person looking at the computer is being told that they're attending to these words with this person in the next cubicle. But interestingly, they also gave them the autistic-like traits questionnaire, and they found that the effect is only present if you have low autistic-like traits, but completely absent for people who have high autistic-like traits. So people, we don't know whether it's people do not sort of represent shared attention with high autistic-like traits. So this precept of we are attending is just not present. Maybe it's present, but it doesn't do anything. It's really a big question. But that's the argument. Okay, so I want to transition back to collective learning and collective action at the end for the rest of the time. So this is what we have in the paper, right, as a theoretical summary in a way, right? Collective learning is attending with others, producing mutual knowledge, right? As you are prioritizing information that you think you're co-attending, the other co-attendees are prioritizing the same information, right? And therefore, mutual knowledge emerges. As targets of shared attention change, as they will, that mutual knowledge changes with that, right? What that allows in the performing domain is collective cognition and collective action. How does this differ from the imitative view? Imitative learning is really fundamentally attending to others that hopefully you learn and it produces individual knowledge. And then in the performing domain, it helps you out by letting you think through the situation better, right? Individual cognition that ultimately leads to really individual action. So what is this collective cognition? I haven't really talked about it at all, although you've prefaced it pretty well. There are three things really I want to talk about. One is shared deliberation, other is shared memory, and the other one is shared motivation. So shared deliberation, 20th century social science will have you convinced that it's far better to give tasks to individuals than to groups. Group polarization, groupthink, right? All these kind of effects. Everybody thinks of Challenger disasters and things like that. But there's far more evidence showing that two minds are better than one, right? In fact, two minds, a group of individuals working on a hard problem are better than the best performing individual working alone, right? So it's not simply the effect of best individuals in that group kind of helping out the weaker ones. It's really, if it was, then the best individuals would have done just as well as the group, right? But it really is something about the combination of group members coming together and thinking together. So shared deliberation is simply the ability to deliberate together, right? As I already alluded to, shared attention, collective learning leads to the ability to have mutual knowledge. Mutual knowledge is a condition that's necessary for effective communication. So you need shared, so therefore shared deliberation. Shared memory. So I don't know how many of you have known this term of transactive memory by Daniel Wegner in the 1990s. Basically, the idea is we can remember far more as a group than we can remember individually, right? Because you're responsible for remembering X, and I'm responsible for remembering Y, right? And we can come together and sort of access each other's knowledge stores. That's the idea behind multidisciplinary teams and so forth. Some people have thought about the internet as a large transactive memory system, right? You search for the right key phrase in the right location, and you find what you need to know. You don't need to remember it. You just need to know where it is, right? So that is transactive memory. You're probably wondering, why is this guy talking about transactive memory, where people remember different things? Hasn't he been talking about the importance of knowing things together versus apart, right? But what's not recognized about transactive memories is that for any system to have a transactive memory, there are things that need to be absolutely mutual knowledge that is known together. And those are things, those are labels and locations, right? You need to know what the expertise is called, right? You need to know the search term, and you also need to know where to look. Now, internet, Google has made it easy. You know where to look. You just look at tap into the Google search. But in normal group deliberation, you really need to know which person remembers what, right? And everybody needs to know that. So when would you need collective learning to maintain a transactive memory system? You would need it when mutual knowledge about locations and labels is constantly in flux. So imagine a surgery team that is going on for 10 hours straight, right? The personnel is rotating in and out, right? The bleeds are multiplying, right? So the locations and the domains of knowledge are all in flux, right? To the extent that you can access that memory, you kind of need to know at the same time where it is and how it's changing, both its location and label. Shared motivation. Right, people have an abundant number of goals and means with which to pursue them, right? But it's now also accepted, more or less, Tomasello has made this argument that a lot of what we do is collectively intended. That is, we imagine that we have a joint goal that we pursue where you and I are doing different things. What collective learning does, though, is it prioritizes which goal we're dealing with right now. Right? There are many, many collective goals. Right? How am I to know which goal are we doing right now? Right? It's really important what we're pursuing together right now, because my role changes depending on the active shared goal. Right? If right now we are listening to this guy speak, well, my role is to listen. But if right now we're asking questions, my goal is to ask questions, right? So collective learning as to the context of our collective, of our shared goal is important. This is not to exhaust the varieties of collective cognition possible through updated mutual knowledge, but just sort of an example of the kind of things that become possible only if you have updated mutual knowledge through learning with others. Okay, cumulative cultural evolution. So when people talk about cumulative cultural evolution, this is the crowning achievement of the human species with the ratchet effect. The fact that I'm presenting on a computer right now, right, is a function of many thousands of years of technology accumulation. So what do we need? Well, people talk about knowledge transmission, right? And typically, from an imitative perspective, knowledge transmission is all about the number of imitators, or at least that's some of the arguments out there, right? The greater number of imitators, the more chance at least one of them will copy correctly, right? But there's something confounded with number of imitators, and that is the more number of imitators there are, the more collective learning there is as well, right? The more people learn together, right? So Derek et al. Have experiments on this, where there increased number of imitators, and sure enough, there's more fidelity in imitating. But what they are also increasing is the strength of collective learning in those events as well. It's not clear how much imitation, how much collective learning is really contributing to the effect of knowledge transmission. Knowledge persistence, of course, for knowledge to be transmitted, it has to persist long enough to be transmitted. And here, it's pretty simple. Transactive knowledge persists better than individual knowledge. Right? Knowledge that's stored in different centers persists better than if one person knows it. Never mind the idea that one person cannot really retain that much knowledge. Right? It really needs to be a group level effect. And then knowledge innovation. I've already touched on this, but this idea of a solitary mind creating innovation all the time, right? May be true, right? That in some cases that does occur. Even in those cases, I would say that solitary mind is using collective frames of reference, right? Frames that are learned collectively with others, right? That solitary mind is prioritizing collective problems in their environment. But I also think that this is due to our individualistic values. The solitary mind is elevated to a degree that is more transparent of our value set rather than what actually happens and how innovation happens. Human uniqueness is something I really want to talk about. So I'm not going to claim that shared attention somehow makes humans unique, but I will say that, because if I do, then somebody will come up with a study showing shared attention in apes, and then I don't want to do that. So that'll be embarrassing. But I do want to say is that a lot of the things that people have argued makes humans unique, like spontaneous teaching, egalitarian norms, theory of mind, involve shared attention, involve collective learning, right? So spontaneous teaching is obvious. Every time I'm teaching, I'm in a state of shared attention. I know very well that we are co-attending to what I'm saying, as you are. Maybe there's a reason there's a certain degree of enjoyment in that shared attention, and that's why people pursue it. Egalitarian norms, right? For me to represent any sort of norm, right? The argument goes, I need to think that we are aware of it. Like our shared awareness of the norm is what gives norm its power, whether it's egalitarian or hierarchical or communal or even a market norm. And then finally, theory of mind. When we mentalize, when we wonder what other people are thinking. So from a collective learning perspective, a theory of mind event where you really wonder what the heck are they thinking happens when collective learning fails, right? So when you have to ask, what are you guys laughing about, right? What is that? What was so weird? What are you referring to? Back to the restaurant example, right? Those are the times you mentalize. You mentalize when you're behind. It's a fail-safe for something that is more fluid, which is collective learning. If collective learning is working, then you can communicate, have transactive memory system that is quite smooth, right? To the extent that you sense that you're behind, you mentalize. I mean, that's one explanation of sort of the relationship between shared attention and theory of mind. And finally, I wanted to touch on digital media. So there's a lot of talk about digital media and its perils. I already referred to the idea that there's quite a bit of shared attention evoked on digital media. And Facebook and Twitter are getting better and better at doing that. YouTube as well does not only now tell you how many people watched in the past, it's constantly telling you how many people are watching with you at the moment, right? I currently don't have high hopes, and this maybe partially addresses this question of, why would if collective learning is adaptive, why can it also lead to mass death, right? Or the person who collectively learns it's to their doom rather than to their success. I mean, I can invoke all sorts of explanations, past environments of small groups where collective learning was actually used for group interaction is not the present environment of social media, where that ability is hijacked, if you will, on a mass scale, right? So the problem with digital media is that, well, many participants are fictitious, so collective action is unlikely to happen. It's really designed to capture minds, right? Not facilitate collective action. Facebook is sort of working a little bit better in terms of having groups, particular groups where people interact and plan and so on. That's better than most. But most of it is really designed to capture your attention, not facilitate collective action. That is, transactive memories and so on. And then finally, and this is probably most importantly, such a high information volume really limits the deep deliberation on any topic. So yeah, there's a lot of shared attention, but there's a lot of shared attention on a million things, right? So how much progress are you going to make on any one thing? Right. So yeah, I mean, I think I'm nearing the end here. I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions and answer your question as well, if I haven't already. And I want to thank you for your collective attention and my various colleagues along the years helping me out. Thank you. I remember it. Did you want to rephrase it?
You remember the question?
Yeah, I remember the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's the idea of, so your question had a bit of it was sort of it reminded me of what happened in the mall in Russia, where people maybe did the wrong thing by following the herd. So that would be an imitation effect rather, so there I would blame imitation rather than collective learning per se. But at the same time, I'm sure we can think of instances where collaboration in a group leads to the demise of the group, right? That certainly happens, right? People who didn't join the Nazi party and who immigrated did better than the ones that did, right? And so there'll certainly be examples like that. Yeah, I don't have an answer for that. It's not a perfect mechanism for human survival. Under certain circumstances, it's going to fail. I really don't have the answer to the criteria that would make it succeed versus fail.
When we speak about this logic or your scheme that collective learning finally leads through memory, emotion, other level to the effective collective action,
yes,
maybe we could agree that it really leads to collective action, but not necessarily effective one.
Yeah, I think that's right.
In terms of the goals.
That's right.
Is this on? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, this is really very, very interesting, but it's fairly abstract and I know you have a lot of knowledge about all kinds of real phenomena that have been distilled here. And as an ethologist, I sort of like to start with the phenomenon and then the natural events. And so when you started your first experiment, I was thinking, well, what about homeschooling and kids learning, only with one person versus in a group?
Right.
And there must be a lot of literature out there showing the cost and benefits of such and how that leads then to performance and so on. when I was at grad school, there was a fellow who was doing a lot of work on juries
Yeah.
and jury deliberations.
Yeah.
And that seems to me, when you were talking about, your three units there, that's very important.
Right.
Are they on the same page
Right.
and the shared knowledge
Right.
and so on?
Right.
And is there literature there that would be
Yeah.
useful in both
Right.
refining and testing some of
Right.
these
Yeah.
ideas?
Yeah, no, those are good comments. I'm starting to cooperate with people, the information sciences school, on, they run all these online classes. And basically a lot of them are classes in which, you put up a videotape lecture and then students access whenever they want. And a lot of the classes are ones with the same exact content, but you have to log in at a particular time where there are other students there, presumably, they're co-attending at the same time. So we're going to test that, to the extent possible.
Yeah, there was all that big hype, about online classes,
Right.
and all these free classes.
Exactly.
And then they found out that
Right.
it
And all of
really
those are
was,
asynchronous. Right.
You don't hear much about that.
Right.
About that anymore.
Yeah.
And then the last comment would be, you moved from these sort of natural kind of situations to the media, which is sort of not
No.
an evolutionarily.
No, it's not, yeah.
And you started making some connections or some comparisons between, small groups and how we sort of
Yeah.
evolved versus this kind of a mass situation. Then you think about Fox News and you get collective information, but it's false.
Oh, absolutely.
And, there should be.
Right. I mean, look, there's an analogy here to, why do we use birth control? So yeah, I mean, the current environment is such that it can hijack the evolved capacity in negative ways. Yeah.
Oh, this,
Yeah. Sorry, I'm trying to find the overview slide.
Sorry, you're stuck with me, Gary.
Okay, go for it.
I was wondering if you would be willing and or able to restrict your definition of collective action.
Okay.
Insofar as, this is horrible, because the first person that comes to mind is Ayn Rand, right? Okay, so in her play...
You always know you're wrong when you start with
Yeah, I know, right? She was Russian. Anyway, her play Anthem talks about a society where people were actually pretty effective at collective action insofar as survival and reproduction and resource gathering and so forth was concerned, but it was very stifling when it came to individual innovation. And of course, she's champion of individual liberty and all that kind of stuff. And you made a comment something along the lines of, we as Americans or in Western individual societies tend to play up the individual rogue who was the person who, rose above the fray and was able to come up with some advance. And I think that does happen a lot. So I'm wondering whether or not, or maybe I'm just biased because I'm so damn American.
No, I think it does happen. It
But
doesn't
I'm
mean that
wondering-
it's not due to collective learning, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it could have been scaffolded from that. But I'm wondering whether or not collective action, the way you're describing it here, maybe, kind of getting along the lines of what Gordon was saying, more relevant in some sort of an environment that's more tied to our evolutionary past. But when it comes to other sorts of thriving, other sorts of advances that maybe aren't so survival and reproduction oriented, that whatever modules we got in our brains that contribute to collective learning and collective action aren't as relevant. So, basic question is collective action broadly construed in your mind, or is it limited to certain kinds of action?
No, collective actions are just ones where the outcome depends on the interaction of multiple agents.
Thank you.
If it requires multiple agents and the informational landscape is constantly changes, you need collective learning as to your context. I feel like that should be true not only for humans, but any sort of system. Yeah.
So if you're looking at like a set of individuals that are clones, as they go through time, their individual learning is going to make them become divergent. And so if you look at the size of the group that you're trying to do mutual learning in, and you're comparing a small group like a working group versus Facebook, is there a size that you're sort of doomed to have it break down? And is that sort of dependent upon sort of like your risk? If you're in battle, a group of 100 may be able to collective learn. If you're on Facebook talking about dogs, it may be 5.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't thought about that. We do know that threat and death and so on are very good at marshaling collective identities, and with it, I presume shared attention, because it's just kind of the same. We are attending, we are here, and so on. So I'd imagine in war you can maintain better shared attention with different others due to threat. It's not bad. Yeah.
kind of elaborate a bit more on evolutionary origins of this? Yeah,
Right.
I'm not sure, quite sure I can see what you meant.
Right. Well, do you mean like kin selection versus group selection?
I don't know, whatever. Just,
Yeah. Right. So the idea here is interdependent action would produce, would be adaptive, right? For genetic reasons. So maybe it starts with kin care, right? But then it jumps to more of a group selection model where groups that can act in a more socially coordinated manner due to collective learning are able to win wars and gather.
Let me rephrase it.
Okay.
I mean, there is a huge number of, evolutionary biologists, anthropologists, sociologists. Everybody's been studying collective action, right? And success in collective action, like cooperation and stuff like that.
Right.
But I mean, without evoking shared attention. So why we need kind of to focus on it? I mean,
On shared attention.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what's
Well, it's because shared attention leads to coordination and collective action. Shared attention is a part and parcel of collective learning.
You're saying it's been basically neglected somehow? I mean, by all these people?
Right. I mean,
the need for shared attention.
Yeah.
I mean, like if people go like to hunt for a group hunting, well, we need definitely to coordinate their action. We need to see what others are doing. But why? I mean, that's I guess it seems kind of more important. Coordinate the actions rather than realize that we are sharing attention. I'm
right.
not sure
So action coordination
Yeah.
to me is an outcome that needs to be explained psychologically through a mode of learning, which imitation doesn't do. Imitation as a learning capacity is virtually the only one that's talked about, right? With some talk about emulation maybe. So what I'm trying to say is like, well, imitation really as a learning capacity leads to, I can understand how it leads to individual action that's successful, avoiding the costs. And yeah, I'm trying to focus on the kind of psychological capacity that would lead to that sort of coordination. Of course, you could start the argument as well, social coordination is important, and that's all we need to know. I'm kind of going backwards and saying, well, what do you really need for that social coordination, moment to moment? And what you need for that is an ability for socially coordinated learning, which I explained in terms of collective learning and shared attention. I should also say that there are two ways of talking about collective action. One is the impulse to cooperate and trust, and much of the literature talks about this. But the way I was talking about it, and I hope it was clear, is that it's really not only the impulse to cooperate and trust, but also the ability to the actual ability to socially coordinate with others. And really with a focus of what kind of psychological learning capacity would you need and why imitation would not suffice. That's all I have. That's all I have.
All right, thanks. Yeah. More questions?
So sort of following on Sergey's point, I think another way to look at it is places where collective action breaks down.
Yeah.
You mentioned sort of the literature on large groups forming identity, and that sort of helps them coordinate. So you could also phrase the need for this idea of shared attention in contexts where that goes away and people then revert to basically not cooperating. So that's another way to motivate sort of the evolutionary origins of it.
Right. No, that's another way of approaching it, I think.
One thing you didn't touch on would be cultural differences. And there's all this literature about individualistic societies versus collectivist society. I spent a lot of time in Japan, and I was sort of amazed how nobody did things independently. I mean, the coordination was amazing, whereas we're much more independently as a society. And so it seems to me that you'd be able to test, or at least get some data that would show differences in different types of groups, different types of societies, including also individual differences. You know, personality plays a role in the effectiveness of committees and the mix of people
Right.
with different.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely possible that collective learning is evoked to different degrees in different circumstances. Like, I mean, from my experience, you know, here in U.S., actually, collective learning is much easier evoked among strangers, if you will, than it is in more collectivistic countries. So I know most people intuit that the more collectivistic you are, the more easier you're going to have collective attention, shared attention, and collective learning. But my experience is that that's not actually the case, because strangers in many collectivistic societies are not really thought as close enough to actually engage in collective attention with, right? While here in the United States, presumably in individualistic society, you grant more agency to complete strangers.
They're rural and urban societies, but they can also practice it.
Right.
In a small town and you're strangers, somebody coming in,
Sure.
you have much more difficulty setting that.
Right. Right.